At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's Chikondi. Let's begin. The first rule of battlefield surgery was simple. The patient was the least of your problems. The mud, the rats, the shelling, the ever-present stench of gas and gangrene, those were the real enemies. The man on the table was just the work. Captain Roland Fitzhugh, Royal Army Medical Corps, found a strange, grim peace in the work. It was a problem of carpentry, really. A messy, bloody-minded sort of carpentry that required a strong stomach and an unsentimental heart. He placed the bone saw against the shattered tibia of a boy who couldn't yet have been shaving for a year, a private from a Manchester Pals battalion. The boy was mercifully unconscious, thanks to a generous dose of laudanum and the systemic shock of having his leg turned into a sack of wet gravel by a German whiz-bang. "Steady now," Fitzhugh murmured as much to himself as to the orderly holding the leg. His own hands were rock steady, a small miracle in the vibrating, thrumming world of the Pré-Salé. The saw bit. The sound was uniquely awful, a wet, grating noise that cut through the thunder of the artillery rumbling outside the tent. Fitzhugh worked with an economy of motion that was almost beautiful in its brutality. He had done this 100 times, 1,000. The number had become a meaningless, grim statistic. In the corner of the dripping, mud-floored medical tent, a new presence observed him. It was a covite, one of the geotic emissaries attached to the British Expeditionary Force, a walking collection of glossy growths and rigid principles. It stood like a statue of interlocking geodes, its mineral limbs catching the flickering lantern light. The aliens were a new complication in this very old game of slaughter. Observers, they called themselves, bound by a strict interstellar uplift prohibition treaty. They were here to learn, to advise on abstract matters of logistics and chemistry, and mostly to get in the way. Fitzhugh finished the cut. The lower leg, or what was left of it, came away in the orderly's hands. The orderly, a boy named Green, didn't flinch. He dropped it into a bucket with a wet slap that echoed silently in the cramped space. "Brazier," Fitzhugh barked, not looking up from the weeping stump. Another orderly, a corporal named Evans, brought a small charcoal stove. A bayonet rested in the coals, its tip glowing a malevolent cherry red. Fitzhugh took the makeshift cauterizing iron by its rifle stock handle, the heat warming his chilled fingers. He leaned over the stump, his face a mask of concentration. With the deliberation of a master painter dabbing a canvas, he pressed the glowing metal against the severed arteries, one by one. The sizzle was loud, obscene. The smell of cooked meat filled the tent, overpowering even the rot and cordite. From the corner came a sound like a cascade of falling shards, a series of discordant, panicked notes that climbed in pitch until they were a single piercing shriek of pure sonic distress. Fitzhugh glanced over, annoyed. The covite observer was vibrating, its mineral facets shuddering violently as if shaken by an unseen hand. Then, with a final, despairing chime that sounded like a breaking heart, it tipped over and shattered on the duckboards like a dropped chandelier. Fitzhugh didn't miss a beat. He finished sealing the last bleeding vessel, his movements unhurried, his focus resolute. "Right," he said, straightening up and wiping a smear of blood from his forehead with the back of his wrist. He looked down at the glittering pile of fragments that had been a sentient being moments before. "Someone get that thing out of my way before I trip on it, and fetch the tea, Corporal. This one's going to live."
"Here's your problem now, Captain."
Major Davies stood in the relative dryness of Fitzhugh's personal dugout, a space barely large enough for 2 men and 1,000 anxieties. He looked even more tired than Fitzhugh felt, which was a remarkable achievement in the long, grueling winter of 1915. Pinned to the mud and timber wall behind him was a crude sketch of a covite with cartoonish X's for eyes. "Sir?" Fitzhugh asked, carefully pouring a measure of whiskey into his tin mug. It was the good stuff, a pre-war bottle he was saving for a truly special disaster. The arrival of the Major, with that particular look on his face, certainly qualified.
Your new attachment.
Davies clarified, gesturing with his thumb toward the dugout's entrance. Standing there, silhouetted against the gray misery of the Selene, was a creature. It was vaguely humanoid, but too slender, too soft-looking, as if assembled from gentler materials than flesh and bone. Its skin was a pale, almost translucent lavender, and its large, dark eyes were like holes punched through to a starless night. It wore an ill-fitting British private's uniform, the rough khaki hanging off its frail frame like a shroud on a willow branch. Fitzhugh's hand paused. He recognized the species. Their advisory delegation in London was known for its quiet, academic nature. He felt a familiar wave of weary exasperation.
"An Alarian, here. Don't they faint if you use a harsh tone of voice?"
Major Davis let out a sound that was half sigh, half groan.
Not just any Alarian, Fitzhugh. The Alarian. Downing Street's little problem.
He lowered his voice, though the creature was well out of earshot.
That's him, the student from Sarajevo.
The whiskey in Fitzhugh's mug trembled. His easy weariness vanished, replaced by a sudden glacial cold. He took a slow, deliberate sip. It burned a welcome path down his throat, but did nothing to warm the ice forming in his gut.
The order comes from the very top,
Davis continued, correctly interpreting Fitzhugh's silence.
A political nightmare. The Alarian government is mortified. As a form of reparations, they've offered him up for cultural re-education. Downing Street, in their infinite wisdom, has decided that means he needs to witness the consequences of his, misguided idealism firsthand. So he's your orderly.
My orderly, Fitzhugh repeated, the words flat and dead.
Keep him alive, but make damn sure he gets an education. I want him to see it, Fitzhugh, to smell it, to swim in it until he drowns. He started this fire. Let him feel the heat.
The Major squeezed past the alien, giving it a wide berth as if it were contagious, and disappeared up the trench steps, leaving Fitzhugh alone with the cause of it all. He drained his mug in one swallow and stood up. The alien took a hesitant step into the dugout, ducking its head. Its voice was soft, melodic, layered with a formal articulation that was utterly out of place in the mud.
Captain Fitzhugh, I am Olin Val. I am at your disposal. I wish to atone for my error.
Fitzhugh set his mug down on the crate that served as his table. The tin made a sharp, angry sound. He walked right up to the Alarian, forcing the slender creature to crane its neck to look at him. Fitzhugh's voice was a low, vicious hiss, colder than any winter wind.
"Error?" he whispered. "You call this an error?"
He grabbed the front of the alien's oversized tunic, bunching the rough fabric in his fist.
"Look at me. Look at me. Do you see the faces out there? The boys missing legs? The ones choking on their own blood in my tent? Every single one of them is an item on a bill you wrote in Vienna because you read a book and misunderstood a metaphor."
Olin Val trembled, a high-pitched hum of distress emanating from its chest. It flinched as Fitzhugh spoke, one delicate hand rising briefly to its temple as if to ward off a sharp noise.
I was told the Archduke was a tyrant,
it stammered.
My studies of human philosophy indicated that the removal of a tyrant is a moral imperative to prevent greater suffering.
"And how's that working out for you?"
Fitzhugh snarled, shoving the alien back a step.
"Take a good long look outside. You've prevented so much suffering you've got it queuing up for amputations. Don't you dare speak to me of philosophy."
He stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, his own rage a shocking, unfamiliar heat in his chest. Then, with a visible effort, he reined it in. He straightened his own uniform, smoothed the front of his tunic, and his face settled back into its customary mask of cold, professional exhaustion. The surgeon was back in control. "Atonement is above my pay grade, Mr. Val," he said, his voice now flat and empty. "The dying, however, is not. Welcome to the butcher's shop." Dearest Eleanor, I hope this letter finds you well and that the garden is not suffering too much from the autumn chill. Things here are the same. The mud is a constant, as is the noise. We have a new attachment, however, which has provided a certain grim novelty to our daily proceedings. It is the alien, the Ilarian assassin from Vienna. He's been assigned to me as an orderly, a decision of such breathtaking absurdity that it could only have been conceived by a committee of men who have never seen a trench. My job is to educate him. Yesterday, that education consisted of him watching me set a compound fracture. He was sick in a bucket for an hour straight. He's not the first observer to find our methods trying. We had a Beetle here last month, a great hulking fellow from a species of philosophers. Took one look at a routine tracheotomy and passed out cold. We used his helmet to carry water for the rest of the day. At least this Ilarian one just vomits quietly. The last one we had, a Covite, literally fell to pieces at the sight of a cauterization. So, in a way, this is an improvement, I suppose. Fitzhugh paused his writing. He picked up his pencil and on the back of the letter began to sketch. He drew a caricature of the slight, large-eyed alien swimming in a ridiculously oversized British uniform, a look of profound cosmic bewilderment on his face. He keeps trying to help. He follows me around with a copy of Gray's Anatomy clutched in his hand like a Bible, as if it contains a holy scripture that will explain us. It is, in its own way, the most tragic thing I have ever seen. He is a creature of quiet libraries and gentle debate, dropped into the middle of a slaughterhouse he inadvertently designed. He is haunted by it all, I can see that much. There's a terrible guilt in his eyes, but guilt doesn't staunch a wound or set a bone. Here it is just another useless weight to carry. Give my love to Mother. Tell her I am quite well and getting plenty of fresh air. Yours as ever, Roland. He folded the letter, tucked it into an envelope, and looked over at Olin Val, who was attempting to fold a blanket. After several minutes of intense concentration, he had succeeded in creating a shape that defied all known principles of geometry. The alien looked up, met Fitzhugh's gaze, and flinched. "Carry on," Fitzhugh said, his voice softer than he intended. The whole damned war was a tragedy, but this was a farce wrapped in an apocalypse. The line of wounded men snaked out from the medical tent's flamp and disappeared into the soupy morning fog. They sat or lay on stretchers, their faces gray with pain and exhaustion, a silent testament to the previous night's raid. It was the walking wounded queue, a collection of men too injured to fight, but not yet injured enough to merit dying immediately. Olin Val, clutching his well-worn anatomy text, approached Fitzhugh with a sense of grave urgency. He pointed a slender, trembling finger at a soldier halfway down the line who was leaning against the trench wall, gripped by a series of deep, rattling coughs that shook his whole frame.
"Captain!"
Olin Val's voice was an intense, desperate whisper.
"That man! By the wall! His vital glow! In his chest! It's faltering! It's being smothered by the sickness! He is a walking blight! He must be separated immediately!"
Fitzhugh was in the middle of stitching a long, clean gash on a corporal's arm. He didn't look up from his work. "His vital glow, you say?"
"Yes, it's a faculty of my people. We perceive the vital glow of biological processes. It is faint in your species, clouded, but unmistakable. The inflammation in his lungs, it is extinguishing his essence. He is a danger to the others."
Fitzhugh tied off the suture with a neat final knot. "Right. Corporal, you'll do. Get back to your post before you catch something worse. He wiped his needle on a rag and finally looked at the frantic Hilarion. He then jerked his chin toward a man lying on a stretcher near the tent's entrance. The man's tunic was open, and he was quite calmly holding his own intestines in a bloody mess tin, trying to keep them from spilling into the mud. "Triage, Mr. Val," Fitzhugh said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "A system for prioritizing treatment. That man has a cough. This man," he gestured to the soldier with the mess tin, "is having, as you might put it, a jailbreak of his internal organs." Olin Val's large eyes swiveled from the coughing soldier to the man on the stretcher. The soldier caught his eye and gave a weak, lopsided grin.
Bit of a draft, ain't it, mate?
The man rasped. The Ilarion's lavender skin went a shade paler, almost gray. He stared at the glistening coils of intestine, at the placid, almost bored expression on the soldier's face. The chasm between the ordered diagrams in his book and the raw, visceral reality in the mess tin was absolute. He made a small, gagging sound. He turned, stumbled a few feet, and was violently sick into a puddle of brackish water. Fitzhugh sighed, a long, weary exhalation. "Now, Mr. Val," he called over, his voice laced with an impatience that had become his default setting. "Are you going to help me change this man's dressings, or are you going to continue redecorating the landscape with your breakfast?" The rumors arrived, as they always did, carried on the whispers of runners and the boasts of staff officers on rare visits to the front. A big push was coming, a German offensive designed to break the stalemate in the Salient once and for all. "Heard it from a bloke in the engineers," Corporal Evans said, sipping his stew in the relative safety of a secondary dugout. "The Jerrys have got something new, some kind of special shell designed by the alien advisor." "A tecton he is," another soldier chimed in. "Big lads, covered in tusks, come from a world where the gravity would turn us into raspberry jam. I think of war as a geology problem, all about applying the right pressure to shatter a rock." Fitzhugh listened, half tuning them out. Every week there was a new wonder weapon that would end the war. Most turned out to be duds. But this one felt different. The chatter was more persistent, the background fear more genuine. To counter the threat, British High Command was doing what it did best, rushing a half-baked, theoretically brilliant idea into the field.
"You'll be getting a new delivery tomorrow, Captain,"
Major Davis had informed him earlier that day.
"The boffins in Cambridge, with a bit of a nudge from our own Ilarian delegation, have perfected a new cooling system for the Vickers gun, based on some sort of thermophilic algae, supposed to be revolutionary. Allows for a sustained rate of fire 4 times greater than the standard water coolant sleeve."
Fitzhugh had merely grunted in response. "Another brilliant idea from the men who are paid to think," he muttered to himself later, cleaning his instruments. "Let's hope it's better than the self-tying boots that dissolved in the rain, or the periscopes that inexplicably attracted lightning." Olin Val, who had been quietly cataloging medical supplies in a corner, overheard him. He looked up from his ledger.
"The theory is sound, Captain,"
he offered, his voice hesitant.
"Ilarian bioengineering is quite advanced. The algae symbiote should be able to dissipate waste heat with remarkable speed."
"Theory, Mr. Val," Fitzhugh said, holding a scalpel up to the lantern light, checking its edge. "Theory is a beautiful thing. It has no mind in it. It doesn't have to account for the fact that a British private can break an anvil with a rubber mallet if you give him half a chance and is properly motivated. We shall see." The new Vickers gun arrived under a slate-gray sky that promised more rain. They were magnificent things, at least on the surface. The standard heavy brass water jacket had been replaced by a series of thick glass tubes filled with a viscous green fluid that pulsed with a soft internal light. The effect was otherworldly, a piece of alien artistry dropped into the grime and filth of a Flanders trench. Looks like a bleeding lava lamp, Sergeant Major Wells grumbled, kicking the tripod for emphasis. The men had already nicknamed it the snot gun. The men from the machine gun corps were more optimistic. They set one up on the firing step, its barrel pointing toward the churned-up hell of no man's land. Olin Val stood nearby, observing with a proprietary anxiety. In the clean rooms and controlled tests back in England, the Ilarian algae coolers had been a miracle. They had fired the weapon for a full minute without a drop in performance, the green tubes glowing brighter and brighter as they harmlessly vented the heat. "Right then," the young lieutenant in charge said, his face flushed with the excitement of wielding the future.
"Let's give Fritz a taste of progress. 5-round burst. On my mark."
The gunner squeezed the trigger. The familiar, terrifying chatter of the Vickers filled the air. Tack, 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 tack. It lasted for 3 seconds. Then came a sound like a wet cough, followed by a hiss and a plume of foul-smelling steam. The pulsing green in the tubes flickered, dimmed, and then went dark, replaced by a sludgy, inert brown. The gun fell silent. The lieutenant stared, his mouth agape.
"What in God's name?"
Olin Val rushed forward, his face a picture of disbelief.
"This is not possible! Wait!"
He knelt, peering at the intake valve. But Sergeant Major Wells, a man who had been fighting since the Boer War and trusted nothing invented after the Lee-Enfield rifle, was already there. He ran a gloved finger along the clogged intake filter. It came away coated in a fine gray paste.
"It's the mud, sir,"
he said, his voice thick with a weary, vindicated disgust.
"This Flanders mud, it's finer than flour, this stuff. The constant vibration from the shells has shaken it through every seal and clogged the filters solid."
He held up his finger.
"The algae can't breathe. It's choked solid."
"No!"
Olin Val whispered, horrified. He pointed at the gray paste.
"The silicate particulate count in this paste is extreme. The samples provided to the Federation delegation were from the Somme sector. This mud is finer, more abrasive. I filed a report noting the potential for geological variance."
His voice trailed off, realizing the futility of it. His warning, like so many others, had been lost in the vast, grinding bureaucracy of the human war machine. A nearby private, a wit from Stepney, snorted.
"Well, that's about as useful as a chocolate teapot, ain't it?"
The failure was total. The brilliant alien theory had met the unparalleled, soul-grinding reality of the trenches and been found wanting. High Command's desperate gamble had failed, and now they had a dozen brand-new, uselessly beautiful machine guns sitting in a sector everyone knew was about to be hit. The world ended at 4 a.m. It began not with a bang, but with a low, guttural roar that grew until the very air vibrated, a sound that bypassed the ears and settled deep in the bones. The German artillery barrage was unlike anything they had ever faced. The shells didn't just explode, they screamed. Fitzhugh's medical tent, reinforced with sandbags and false hope, shook as if in the grip of a giant. Dirt rained down from the ceiling. A lantern swayed, throwing wild, dancing shadows across the scene of frantic, organized chaos. The casualties started arriving within minutes, a tide of broken men carried on stretchers of groaning canvas. They swamped the tent, filling every available space, their moans and cries a terrible chorus under the percussion of the shells. Fitzhugh worked like a machine, moving from man to man, his mind a cold, clear island in a sea of red. He amputated, he stitched, he staunched. But as he worked, he began to notice something different about the wounds. They were ragged, vicious. He was probing a deep wound in a soldier's shoulder when his forceps grated against metal. Carefully, he worked the piece of shrapnel free. It was still warm. He held it up in the flickering light, turning it over. "My God," he muttered. It was not a simple shard of steel. It was a twisted, cruel-looking thing, about 2 inches long. Along one edge, a series of smaller, razor-sharp hooks had been forged into the metal, like the barbs on a fishing lure. "It's barbed," Fitzhugh said to no one in particular, his voice grim. "It's designed not just to penetrate, it's designed to snag, to tear on the way out." He could almost hear the cold, geological logic of the Tecton advisor behind it. A weapon engineered not for a clean kill, but for maximum trauma, for a wound so complex it would overwhelm the medics, drain resources, and spread terror. It was malevolently, brutally intelligent. Amidst the carnage, Olin Val was useless for surgery. He had tried to help, tried to hold a man's hand, but the sheer, overwhelming gore sent him staggering back, his frail constitution no match for the abattoir. But then, as he backed away from a particularly gruesome chest wound, his eyes fell upon the large chalkboard Fitzhugh used for tracking morphine supplies. An idea, born of desperation and a mind wired for order, sparked within him. He picked up a piece of chalk. While Fitzhugh and the orderlies fought to save lives with their hands, Olin Val began to fight with his mind. He couldn't stomach the surgery, but he could track the flow. He started marking down names, injuries, triage priority, and supplies used. He saw a bottleneck with the hot water and directed an orderly to a secondary stove. He noticed they were running low on bandages and dispatched another to the supply dump before Fitzhugh even realized it. His formal, academic Ilarian mind, which saw the world as a series of interconnected systems, had found its purpose. He couldn't stop the bleeding, but he could map the chaos. He became the tense clerk, the nerve center, creating a logical flow that shaved precious minutes off every procedure. And in this place, minutes were the difference between a name on a list and a letter home. The shelling stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The sudden silence was more deafening than the noise. It was just after midnight, Christmas Eve, 1916. A hesitant voice began to sing from the German trenches, a lonely, clear tenor on a rendition of Still Nacht. Then another voice joined in from the British side, this one in English, Silent Night. A private near Fitzhugh lowered his rifle. "Bloody hell, a truce! Haven't seen one of these since the first year. Thought High Command put a stop to this nonsense." But the spirit, it seemed, was infectious. Men, cautious at first, poked their heads over the parapets. Then figures moved in the shell-pocked wasteland of no man's land. "Come on," Fitzhugh said, grabbing his flask and a packet of cigarettes. He looked at Olin Val, who was staring out at the surreal scene, his large eyes wider than ever. "You wanted an education? Class is in session." They clambered over the parapet. The air was cold and smelled of frost. In the middle of the wasteland, under a sky full of indifferent stars, British and German soldiers were meeting. They were shaking hands, sharing schnapps and cigarettes, showing each other wallet-worn pictures of their families. A German officer with a neatly trimmed mustache and an iron cross pinned to his chest approached them. "Guten Abend," he said, his English stiff but clear. "Feldarts Richter." He gestured to the towering figure standing beside him, a creature that seemed to have been carved from granite. It was over 7 feet tall, with thick gray hide-like skin and 2 small, upward-curving tusks framing a broad, impassive mouth. It was a Tecton. It was Dern. "Captain Fitzhugh," Fitzhugh replied, shaking Richter's hand. He nodded towards the silent giant. "And your attachment?" "Dern," the Tecton rumbled, its voice a low rumble like shifting bedrock. "An honor to observe." Richter gave a wary smile. "He insisted on coming. He wishes to gather data on troop morale under non-combat conditions." He leaned a little closer. "Do you happen to have any acetyl salicylic acid, aspirin? Our last supply was contaminated by a gas canister leak." I might be able to spare a bottle, Fitzhugh said, a small human transaction in the midst of inhumanity. Professional courtesy. Thank you. Richter looked out at the mingling soldiers. Then he at least understands pressure and force. He respects the stone he is trying to break. He sighed. Our other guest, the Kellen chemist who gave us our new gas, he finds a certain elegance in equations of toxicity. He sees your soldiers not as men, but as variables in a chemical reaction. I find his perspective lacking in professional courtesy. While the two human doctors talked, Dern stood back, a silent monolith of pragmatism, observing as a Scottish soldier and a Bavarian corporal roared with laughter while comparing their trenchfoot remedies. This was not a moment of shared humanity. It was a psychological anomaly to be studied. Olin Val, however, was utterly, profoundly bewildered. His mind, which operated on logic and predictable systems, could not process the scene. These were the same beings, the ones who designed barbed shrapnel and the ones who shared their lost cigarette, the ones who slaughtered each other by the thousand, and the ones who now sang carols together in the cratered mud. It was a paradox that his entire culture, his entire way of thinking, had no framework for. It was madness. Glorious, terrifying, incomprehensible madness. The truce ended with the cold, gray light of dawn. A single reluctant shot from somewhere down the line signaled the resumption of hostilities, and the men scurried back to their respective burrows. The war was on again. Later that day, Fitzhugh found Olin Val standing on the firing step, staring out at the German lines, heedless of the risk of snipers. The alien wasn't looking at the enemy defenses, but seemed to be looking through them, at the very concept of them. "They'll shoot you if you stand there long enough," Fitzhugh said quietly, coming up beside him. Olin Val didn't turn. His voice was a strained whisper, struggling to give form to a thought that was too large and too strange for his own language.
I do not understand.
"There's a great deal of that going around," Fitzhugh said, lighting a cigarette.
My people, we have conflict,
The alien continued.
but it is logical. It is based on resource scarcity or irreconcilable philosophical differences. It is governed by strict rules. When the conflict is resolved, it is over. But this,
He gestured vaguely at no man's land.
this is not logical.
He turned to face Fitzhugh, his dark eyes full of a desperate need to comprehend.
They try to kill you with weapons of exquisite cruelty. You try to kill them with equal ferocity. And then, for one night, you share songs and chocolate. You mourn their dead, and they mourn yours. Today, a man in your trench will die because a man in their trench is a better shot. Tomorrow, that same rifleman might weep because he has run out of pictures of his daughter to show his enemies.
Olin Val shook his head, a gesture of profound confusion.
It is chaos. There are no consistent principles. Your cruelty is not absolute. Your kindness is not constant. You are not constrained by reason.
He paused, searching for the right word, the right concept.
You are terribly free.
Fitzhugh looked at the small, frail alien who had started this bloody mess out of a misplaced, logical sense of idealism. He saw the genuine, agonizing struggle in his eyes. The cold anger he had held onto had long since evaporated, replaced by a strange, shared sense of exhaustion. He reached out and clapped Olin Val on his thin shoulder. The alien flinched at the unexpected contact, but didn't pull away. It was a clumsy, gruff gesture of acceptance, of a bond forged in mud and madness. They stood there for a moment, two utterly different beings, staring out at a war neither of them truly understood. The intelligence, when it came, was solid. A runner, gasping for breath and covered head to toe in mud, delivered the flimsy to Major Davis's command dugout. The Germans were planning a final, decisive attack, a knockout blow to shatter the Ypres-Ali. The primary assault was aimed directly at their sector. They planned to use a new, fast-acting gas in the opening moments. Worse, the preliminary barrage would consist entirely of the Tecton-designed barbed shrapnel, meant to shred the front line and its command structure. Their own command structure was already teetering. The linchpin of their defense, the weak point everyone knew about, was the machine gun post at the critical junction between two battalions. The post that still had one of the new experimental Vickers guns, the useless, beautiful snot gun. Fitzhugh sat in his tent, listening to the rain tap against the canvas, a hollow feeling in his stomach. He was sharpening his favorite amputation saw, the steel whispering against the stone. He had a feeling it was going to be a very busy day. The attack came with the dawn, not as a roar, but as a series of soft, wet thumps. The gas shells, a sickly, greenish-yellow fog, smelling faintly of pineapple and pepper, began to creep across no man's land, hugging the ground like a predatory mist. Klaxons blared. Men scrambled for their gas masks, their movements clumsy and panicked. Then came the artillery, the real barrage, the air filled with the demonic shriek of the Tecton shells. The earth bucked and heaved. As predicted, the machine gun post at the critical junction fired for less than 10 seconds before its algae cooler failed. The gun fell silent, creating a fatal, gaping wound in the line. German shock troops, clad in heavy armor and moving with terrifying speed, poured through the breach. Moments later, a deafening explosion ripped through the air just behind the front line, a direct hit on the command dugout. The chaos in Fitzhugh's medical tent was absolute. The gas was sweeping in under the flaps, forcing them all to work in the claustrophobic horror of their respirators. The flow of wounded was no longer a tide, it was a tsunami. Then the flaps were thrown open, and two stretcher-bearers stumbled in, carrying a figure whose uniform was caked in mud and blood. It was Major Davis. He was alive, but barely. A junior officer, a boy with terror in his eyes, followed them in, tripping over a bucket.
He's alive!
The lieutenant shouted, his voice muffled and distorted by his mask.
Captain, he has to live! The dugout's gone! The plans were for a staged withdrawal, but the breach... He's the only one with the authority and the knowledge of the new dispositions to coordinate a divisional counterattack. Without him, the reserves will be sent in piecemeal and slaughtered.
Fitzhugh pushed through the throng of wounded and knelt by the major's side. A single, jagged piece of metal was lodged deep in his chest, just to the left of his sternum. It was the barbed Tecton shrapnel. A river of dark blood pulsed gently around it, in time with the major's fading heartbeat. The tent shook with the impact of another nearby shell, knocking jars of iodine from a shelf. Fitzhugh ignored it. His world had narrowed to the few square inches of the major's chest. Davis' breathing was shallow, a wet, rattling sound. He was fading fast. An orderly, a young man named Peterson, who had been a medical student in another life, gently probed the edges of the wound. He looked up at Fitzhugh, his eyes wide with despair above his gas mask.
"It's inoperable, sir,"
he said, his voice trembling.
"I can feel it, the barb. It's hooked around the aorta. If we try to pull it, we'll tear the whole thing open. He'll bleed out in seconds."
The words hung in the poison-tinged air, a death sentence. The line was broken. The reserves were blind. The battle was lost. Fitzhugh stared at the wound, at the malevolent piece of alien engineering lodged in his commanding officer's heart. His mind raced, searching for an answer that wasn't there. He felt a presence beside him and looked up. It was Olin Val. The alien was clutching his anatomy textbook like a shield, his face, visible through the goggle-like lenses of his own specially designed respirator, was a mask of focused intensity. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't vomiting. He was studying the problem. And in that moment, everything clicked into place. The alien's strange senses, his obsessive poring over the diagrams and charts of the human body. The way he saw the world not as flesh and blood, but as a system of energy.
Your glows.
Fitzhugh said, his voice suddenly urgent, cutting through the din.
The vital glows.
He pointed from the textbook to the dying major.
You've studied the maps. Can you see the real thing?
Olin Val looked from the book to the wound, and for the first time, Fitzhugh saw not terror in the alien's eyes, but a terrible, resolute understanding.
Yes,
Olin Val said, his voice clear and steady.
I can.
A whispered, frantic ballet began, performed on the precipice of disaster. Fitzhugh called for his finest scalpel, for hemostats, for silk sutures. The tent became a hushed operating theater in the heart of an earthquake. Olin Val knelt on the other side of the stretcher. He closed his large, dark eyes, overcoming a lifetime of instinctual revulsion. He placed the delicate, three-fingered tips of one hand on the major's chest, just beside the wound, his touch as light as a moth's wing. His other hand held the anatomy textbook open, the pages fluttering in the draught. He wasn't looking at the book, but Fitzhugh knew he was seeing its diagrams overlaid on the living, dying reality beneath his fingers.
I can see it,
Olin Val whispered, his voice a low hum, audible only to Fitzhugh.
The primary barb is twisted. It has snagged the outer advential layer of the aortic arch.
Guide me,
Fitzhugh said, his scalpel poised.
2 millimeters to the left of your scalpel tip,
Olin Val murmured.
The phrenic nerve. It is agitated. Be cautious.
Fitzhugh made a small, clean incision. Blood welled up, but an orderly was there instantly, swabbing it away.
Now,
the alien continued, his voice never rising above a calm, instructional tone.
Angle the forceps down towards the spine, 30 degrees. The barb is curled clockwise. You must unhook it, Captain. You cannot pull. Rotate it counterclockwise along its own curve.
It was a blind surgery on the most vital vessel in the human body, in a shaking tent in the middle of a gas attack. But Fitzhugh's hands were steady. Forged in the crucible of 1,000 such hopeless moments, they moved with a surgeon's grace and a soldier's resolve. He slid the forceps in, his touch guided not by his own eyes, but by the alien's mind.
Gently,
Olin Val breathed.
You are touching it now. The tissue is stressed. Rotate slowly.
Fitzhugh's knuckles were white. He could feel the faint, horrible grating of metal against tissue through the steel of the forceps. He rotated his wrist a fraction of a degree. Time seemed to slow down. The shelling outside faded to a distant hum. The only reality was the feedback from the tips of his instrument.
It is free,
Olin said, with a note of profound wonder in his voice. With infinite care, Fitzhugh withdrew the forceps. Clamped in their jaws was the twisted, barbed piece of Tecton shrapnel, glistening and red. He had done it. He dropped it into a metal tray with a loud clatter that broke the spell.
Sutures!
He barked, his voice raw.
Now!
Against all odds, against all logic, the heart of the British defense in the Ypres continued to beat. Major Davies, conscious and mostly lucid within 10 minutes, was able to gasp out the vital coordinates. The reserves, finally unleashed with purpose and direction, surged forward into the breach, their bayonets fixed. The German shock troops, their momentum broken, were caught in a vicious crossfire. The line, which had been stretched to the breaking point, held. An hour later, the sounds of battle had receded. The German push had failed. Fitzhugh, his gas mask off, slumped against a crate of medical supplies, every muscle in his body aching with exhaustion and relief. He was covered in mud, sweat, and the Major's blood. He pulled his whiskey flask from his tunic. The special bottle was long gone. This was the rough trench stuff, and took a long, burning swallow. He looked over at Olin Val. The alien was sitting on a low stool, his own respirator discarded. He was staring at his hands, which were stained with the same blood. He hadn't fainted. He hadn't vomited. He had simply endured. Fitzhugh held out the flask. "Go on," he said, his voice hoarse. "You've earned it." Olin Val looked at the flask, then at Fitzhugh. His people considered alcohol a volatile neurotoxin, but this was something else, a ritual, a sacrament of survival. He hesitated, then took the flask. He raised it to his lips and took a small, tentative gulp of the harsh whiskey. His entire body shuddered. A violent, racking cough seized him, bringing tears to his large eyes. But when the coughing subsided, he was still upright. Through the tears, he even managed a weak, shaky smile. It was a small victory in a war of millions, a private triumph in a world of public slaughter. But in the muddy, blood-soaked confines of Tent 6, it felt absolute. The practice was quiet. The loudest sound in Fitzhugh's small surgery in the Kent countryside was the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece and the buzzing of a bee against the window pane. The war was a memory, a collection of scars both seen and unseen. He was a country doctor now, treating coughs and setting the bones of children who fell out of apple trees. The postman brought a small, unusually heavy package one morning. It had no stamps, only a series of strange swirling symbols burned into the brown paper. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like spun silver, was a sleek metallic device of non-human design. It was smooth, cool to the touch, and utterly alien. Beneath it was a note, written on a thin, parchment-like material in precise, elegant English script.
"Captain Fitzhugh, I hope this finds you in good health. My duties as a junior diplomat for the Alarian Federation often bring me into contact with records of our species' initial observations of yours. Your name appears with some frequency. My formal testimony to the Interstellar Assembly did not focus on grand strategy or technological disparity. I spoke only of a single moment, a human surgeon, exhausted and under fire, performing an audacious operation in a poisoned atmosphere, his hands guided by the senses of a being he had every reason to despise. I argued that pure logic cannot account for such an event. It appears some of the assembly found this compelling. My report, combined with the Tecton Dern's tactical analysis of the Christmas truce, has been elevated to the Primary Contact Committee for formal review. It has caused a significant realignment of opinions regarding pre-warp sentience models. For a body that moves at a geological pace, this is tantamount to a revolution. I have taken the liberty of enclosing a small diagnostic tool from my homeworld. Should you ever encounter a case of a cough, you will find it far more useful than listening for faltering vital glows. P.S. I have also enclosed a bottle of Klar. It is an Alarian beverage made from fermented starlight moss. It is considered a superior celebratory drink. It is less quarrelsome than whiskey.
Fitzhugh smiled. He picked up the strange alien bottle and looked out the window at the peaceful English countryside, a world away from the mud and the madness. He thought of the noise, the fear, and the impossible, stubborn courage of men holding their own guts in a tin mess cup. He thought of a frail, terrified alien who learned to see in the dark. Terribly free. The alien's words came back to him, clear as a bell. He uncorked the bottle, the air filled with a scent like fresh rain and distant stars. He was right, Fitzhugh thought, pouring a small measure into a clean glass. Free enough to build a slaughterhouse that spanned a continent, and free enough to find a reason to sing carols in the middle of it. Free enough to start a war by accident, and free enough to save a life against all reason.